There are few concepts as important to philosophy as the concept of idea, since ideas are the building blocks of philosophy. And Deleuze certainly does not fail to address the topic, quite the opposite. It's one of his central concerns. Yet, the manner in which he usually treats it is surprising. It leads to a complete reversal of what we usually define as thinking. In this video, we will examine a few key points regarding Deleuze's notion of idea, namely the nature, in particular the formal nature, of this reversal. The fact that it puts difference in charge of the idea in and through the eternal return, the fact that difference is understood as an impersonal passage between faculties, and finally the great mystery at the heart of becoming, namely the feedback loop by which we never cease to become who we are. For the sake of clarity, let's begin with an example. If you have read some of Deleuze's works, you may have noticed his tendency to produce certain distinct types of sentences. Most spectacularly, perhaps, is the so-called anti-metaboly, which is the reversal of the order of words in the previous sentence. A famous example of an anti-metaboly would be one for all and all for one. It is quite a typical form you'll find in Deleuze. For example, it's not Oedipus that produces neurosis, it's neurosis that produces Oedipus. In using this form, Deleuze is doing something quite interesting. He reverses the usual or received way we think by changing the form of a proposition. In this case, how psychoanalysis understands neurosis. This strange identity between form and content is not just chance or style, it's at the heart of Deleuze's thought. His entire philosophy presents a great reversal regarding the way in which ideas are formed and how we think. So, what exactly is reversed, and why is it reversed? The reason for this great reversal is part of the famous critique of representation that Deleuze develops most notably in Difference and Repetition. When he says the task of modern philosophy has been defined to overturn Plato, he implies that there is a problem with Platonism, and this problem in a nutshell is that Platonism postulates what it actually produces. So, for example, psychoanalysis, which exemplifies Platonism, postulates the Oedipus complex to explain neurosis, when in fact it's just the opposite. More generally, Platonism typically poses as a priori four elements, which you can call the four horsemen of representation, as conditions of the exercise of thought. These are the one, the analogous, the similar, and the negative. Platonism tells us that we cannot think if there is no unity of thought, or if we cannot perform judgment, reminiscence, or conceive of that which does not exist. But all of this is challenged by Deleuze, in his own writings as well as in his collaboration with Guattari. In many ways, this is the heart of Deleuze's philosophy. Let us examine this quote from Difference and Repetition, where Deleuze offers two propositions, one which is typical of Platonism, the other typical of his own views. Consider the two propositions, only that which is alike differs and only differences are alike. The first formula posits resemblance as the condition of difference. It therefore undoubtedly demands the possibility of an identical concept for the two things which differ, on condition that they are alike, and implies an analogy in the relation each thing has to this concept, and finally leads to the reduction of the difference between them to an opposition determined by these three moments. According to the other formula, by contrast, resemblance, identity, analogy, and opposition can no longer be considered anything but effects, the products of a primary difference or a primary system of differences. This is the heart of the great reversal that Deleuze proposes to operate on Platonism, which in many ways designates all pre-Nietzschean philosophies, with notable exceptions of course, but generally it can be summarized as follows. The idea, whether in the form of reminiscence, judgment, sensation, or negation, is always a force, a power to affect and be affected, a form, not a content. And this implies that the idea is based on difference. It's a change. It's a process of change, like when energy passes from one body to the next. So if, as Deleuze says, it is true that Platonism already represents the subordination of difference to the powers of the one, the analogous, the similar, and even the negative, then the overturning of Platonism means the submission of these four horsemen of representation to the powers of difference. So of course we have to ask, how do we do this, and what does it mean? Well, we do this by rejecting the old dialectics of the one and the multiple and replace it with actual multiplicity. Deleuze says, multiplicity which replaces the one no less than the multiple is the true substantive, substance itself. The variable multiplicity is the how many, the how and each of the cases. Everything is a multiplicity insofar as it incarnates an idea. Who then commands multiplicity? Multiplicity is operated by the eternal return in person. It is the eternal return who chases the four horsemen of representation away. Deleuze says, the eternal return eliminates that which renders it impossible by rendering impossible the transport of difference. It eliminates the presuppositions of representation, namely the same and the similar, the analogous and the negative. You can see why the concept of multiplicity is so important for Deleuze. Not only does it replace Plato's old concept of essence, but it is also the motor of difference itself. For difference is always a difference of potential between poles, polarities, and therefore an idea is the tendency of life or energy to pass from one to the other. This is what creates movement. But you might say, wait a second, how does this relate to our ideas of the real world? Ideas which we conceive from outside, for example like the idea of a dog. Well, in this case, as in all others, the idea itself is a multiplicity, a passage. The passage will be operated between the potential of certain faculties, of which Deleuze identifies four. How exactly those faculties come into being we cannot discuss here because it's quite long and complicated, but in a nutshell, the faculties are, following a definition of Bergson that Deleuze likes a lot, that which increases the gap between action and reaction, that which actually separates the two. So a faculty fundamentally is a reactive force that can react over or in relation to an active force. In technical terms, it is that which can separate active force from its power. But here is the crucial part. Ideas appear in the depth of our power to be affected. It's not sensation exactly, but rather the ability to be informed, either spatially or intensively, to be marked or traced by something. So in other words, it's a form of reactivity through which we can actualize a potential, the potential to be affected. And it is out of the actualized potential that the things we usually identify as the conditions of representation, namely the four horsemen of representation, actually emerge. Deleuze says, what is most important, however, is that between sensibility and imagination, between imagination and memory, between memory and thought, when each disjointed faculty communicates to another the valence which carries it to its own limit, every time it is a free form of difference which awakens the faculty, and awakens it as the different within that difference. So it is with difference in intensity, disparity in the phantasm, dissemblance in the form of time, the differential in thought. Opposition, resemblance, identity, and even analogy are only effects produced by these presentations of difference, rather than being conditions which subordinate difference and make it something represented. So you see how the formal reversal of the eternal return puts difference in charge, such that an idea now becomes a genesis, a temporal process, rather than a fixed image. The process of the eternal return itself manages the passage of difference between faculties, and the manner in which this passage occurs is not peaceful at all, but it's a kind of order. A pattern is forming which is absolutely impersonal. In the following quote, notice how beautifully Deleuze rejects any form of a priori subjectivity. There is indeed a serial connection between the faculties and an order in that series, but neither the order nor the series implies any collaboration with regard to the form of a supposed same object or to a subjective unity in the nature of an I think. It is a forced and broken connection which traverses the fragments of a dissolved self, as it does the borders of a fractured I. The transcendental operation of the faculties is a properly paradoxical operation, opposed to their exercise under the rule of a common sense. In consequence, the harmony between the faculties can appear only in the form of a discordant harmony, since each communicates to the other only the valence which confronts it with its own difference and its divergence from the others. Kant was the first to provide the example of such a discordant harmony, the relation between imagination and thought which occurs in the case of the sublime. There is therefore something which is communicated from one faculty to another, but it is metamorphosed and does not form a common sense. If you recall, we have seen in a previous video how the subject is constructed, how it appears within the process of sense-making. The subject is produced by an elevation of the cycle of ideas between the faculties. This is why Deleuze says that ideas are problems, but problems only furnish the conditions under which the faculties attain their superior exercise. This superior exercise is their power of limitation. It's the power of aion to cut the present of chronos in parts. It is the birth of the quasi-divine transcendental subject. So the transcendental subject does not appear all formed in a given environment. Rather, it forms itself a particular environment, a particular geography. The consequence of this state of affairs is that the individual fundamentally is a feedback loop, which is what Deleuze means when he says in Nietzschean philosophy that forces are plastic. This plasticity, the change in form that it creates, is the object of the genesis of power. What does power will? It wills precisely that which derives from the genetic element. The genetic element, power, determines the relation of force with force and qualifies related forces. As plastic element, it simultaneously determines and is determined, simultaneously qualifies and is qualified. So to be concrete, the genetic element is your personal story. It's all the active forces, Deleuze says the nomadic tribes, that currently compose you here and now, and which express in their own ways the abundance of life itself around a certain set of qualified ideas, which you call I. But precisely, you can call it I by virtue of its ability to change itself. It's the process of becoming who you are, as Nietzsche says. The bottom line is, because we have a capacity to affect and be affected, and to affect ourselves, we are particular expressions of the great substance, of life itself, that becomes what it is as we become who we are. This special capacity we have to affect ourselves with our ideas and actions comes from the fact that ideas have the power to change themselves. And the great mystery of all of this is that, to use a metaphor, we as individuals are like a chameleon trying to imitate what it sees in a mirror, always changing and yet always becoming what it is. So this is what I wanted to talk about today. I hope it was useful. Just as a quick update for the channel, I probably won't be able to publish one video per week as I announced, but I'll do my best and I'll keep them coming. For now, thank you for watching and see you soon.